Good morning, everyone. What a great group this morning. We'll get started in just a minute. We still have a number of folks who are joining us. While we're getting ready to get started, feel free to put your name, organization, and maybe the location from where you're calling in from this morning. Put that in the chat and we can welcome one another. It's great to see such a nice group this morning. All right. Morning, Lee and Nate. Morning, Allison. Thanks for adding a little bit to the chat. You want to put your name, organization, and where you're calling from, and we'll get started in just a moment. All right. Morning, Eric and Megan, Francis, Amy. What a great group. Well, why don't we get started? I know that we'll have a few more folks joining us this morning, but we definitely want to get started and get to our presenters who I know we're all excited to hear from. So my name is Paul Masiarchin with the Minnesota Council on Foundations, and I want to welcome all of you this morning. MCF is collaborating with an inspiring group of advocates who form the WASH Coalition. WASH is We Are Still Here. It's a movement that is working to challenge systems of oppression and to enliven and retell the story of Native Americans. At MCF, we're fortunate to have opportunities to walk on this path with the WASH Coalition. And I want to especially thank three individuals, Ramona Quito Stately, Sarah Hernandez, and Joanne Stately, three of the main collaborators in planning today's session. I'm really looking forward to learning with all of you and with them. And I want to turn it over to Joanne Stately for introductions. So welcome, Joanne.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning, everyone. As has been mentioned, I'm Joanne Stately, and I have the distinct pleasure of serving as co-chair on WASH as we look at philanthropy as one of our priorities for influence and helping to raise the narrative and create the visibility of Native peoples and Native nations here in the state of Minnesota. My co-chair is Sarah Hernandez, who is works at the McKnight Foundation, and it's been a distinct pleasure to work under the leadership of Ramona Quito Stately. Today, we're going to have a second in a series of opportunities for philanthropy to learn more about very key issues that we are facing here in the state of Minnesota, but also just across the nation of all our Indian relatives and our tribal nations. We have a very distinct presentation that'll be provided both by Carly Badhart-Bull and Stephanie Zador, who are going to have a presentation that's going to look at some of those issues that would be considered 101 in Indian country, but it's really important for us to have kind of a level setting or really having that grounding in what those key issues are. I'm also particularly touched to be able to do this for myself as being an enrolled member of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe and a citizen of the White Earth Nation. A role that I hold, a position that I hold, a heritage and legacy that I hold. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce these two individuals who are representing their nations as well, and also being part of the Native Ways Federation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carly and then to Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I am so grateful to be here. I apologize having some technical issues this morning and not able to use my video. I keep getting kicked off. But grateful to be able to at least share my voice with you all. Want to thank MCF, all of the WASH folks for inviting us. We're incredibly grateful for the support in bringing us to your members today to share this important information. And so, as we begin, we're interested in hearing from everyone. And we want to think, what we're hoping is that folks can think back on your own formal education throughout your life, from kindergarten to graduate school. And we just want to know, like, how many days did you learn about Native communities? And I know Paul has set up a Zoom poll. Stephanie, I think, is initiating that. But please share your response. Feel free to share your response in the chat if the Zoom poll doesn't work for you. But we want to know, and we also recognize that the number is probably pretty small, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Don't be ashamed. There is a lot that folks don't know about our Native communities, and that is because of the very intentional policies and practices to erase our people. A study was published in 2015 that found that 87% of state history standards across the country don't mention Native history post 1900. And 27 states at that time, the report said that there were 27 states that had no mention of a single Native American in their K through 12 curriculum. And so if you don't know, there's reasons for it. And again, that's part of why we're here today. And also I just want to mention that, keeping that in mind, we have less than 90 minutes together today, both for the presentation and to answer questions. And there's just no way that we're going to possibly cover everything you would want or need to know about Native people, Native history. There's not time to address all the misconceptions and stereotypes. But we're here to provide a essential foundation from which you can continue learning through resources that we share. We want you to find us as a resource. And what we hope is that this is the beginning of a conversation, and that we can build a relationship with you all and help you in your pursuit of building relationships with the Native communities in Minnesota. And beyond, because we know that many of the foundations who are present in this conversation, some of you are, fund specifically in Minnesota, but you also, there are also folks who fund beyond those colonial boundaries. And so just want to acknowledge that too. We also just want to share that, you're going to have to do some work to learn more and act. And we're going to be sharing slides after the presentation, so you can revisit and click links to resources and references throughout, so you can do that. We also don't pretend to be experts on every topic of Native nations and communities, but we're connected to a lot of Native nonprofits and Native experts in every field across the sector, across multiple sectors. So just want to put that out there and hope that we can help be a connector for you all. With that, want to start with or kind of move into just sharing some of our traditional greetings. So Hamitaku Yipi Ishkian Wachian Kapie Wash Shichu Ia Carly Badharpol Emakiapie Dakota Ia Tokadakiam Maniwi Mieye Damakota Bede Wakantuma Hemache Wakpa Ipaksha Hemataha Bede Otue Dedwatie. So hello, friends and relatives. Again, my name is Carly Badharpol. In Dakota, my name is Tokadakia Maniwi, or Woman Who Walks Toward the Future. I'm Bede Wakantuan Dakota and a citizen of the Flandreau Santee tribe. I live in our Dakota homelands in Minneapolis, even though my tribe is in South Dakota. And there's reasons for that, as our people were exiled from the state of Minnesota. But part of sharing this greeting is just helping you to understand a little bit about the importance of introducing ourselves in our language. And with that, Stephanie, did you want to introduce yourself?
Niawe Skeno, Stephanie Nigiaso Onandwaga Nia Agatayotmi. I'm thankful you are well. Stephanie is my English name. I'm Seneca. We call ourselves Onandwaga, which means people of the Great Hill. I'm of the Wolf Clan, and my family is from Four Corners near Clear Creek on the Cattaraugus Territory. And when meeting other Senecas, I might also share my parents' and my grandparents' names. I'm the Operations and Programs Manager at Native Ways. I grew up in Virginia, just outside of DC, and lived in Minneapolis for 9 years, where I graduated from the University of Minnesota. My last role there was in admin and operations at St. Stephen's Human Services in Minneapolis, before moving back home to New York to our reservation in 2019.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, we wanted to start with this because when you go to events in our communities, oftentimes meetings, celebrations, honorings, you're going to hear our language spoken, and you're going to hear folks. Oftentimes, the beginning of the meeting can take a really long time as folks start with the introductions and helping folks understand the communities that we come from. When I share, I'm, Dakota from Flandreau. When I share that my father is Sid Bean, when I share, all of that information helps folks in the room to understand how we might be connected. And that's really important for us as Indigenous communities. And so I just wanted to share that with you because as you're hosting events in Native communities, it's really important to make sure to spend that time in the introductory period to be able to kind of share where folks are from. And I know it's hard with Zoom. We're doing the best we can, but it's also still really important. Next slide, please, Stephanie. All right, so Stephanie and I are from Native Ways Federation. We're an organization which was incorporated nearly 15 years ago by leaders of 7 national Native-led nonprofit organizations who are now our founding members. They started coming together around some common agenda items, particularly around the issue of the lack of investment by philanthropy in Native nonprofits, in Native-led nonprofits, and the concern that many of the larger scale investments that were being made in the name of serving our communities were actually being made to non-Native organizations. So unfortunately, these issues still exist today. And so in response, our mission is to activate and expand informed giving to nonprofits in Indian country through donor education and advocacy. And we're strengthening the circle of giving by uniting the Native nonprofit sector, influencing philanthropy and advocating for systemic change across. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So why are we here today? Why is it important that you're here? Let's think about all foundation giving by large foundations and community foundations. And can everybody please make a guess in the chat or in the Zoom survey that's I know Stephanie is sharing, and we're going to share the responses to this when we're done here. But what percentage of total giving by foundations do you think goes to Native organizations and Native causes? It may be helpful for you to know that in 2010, 1.7% of the US population identified as American Indian or Alaska Native alone or with other races. And according to the 2020 census, that number has increased to 2.9%. Stephanie, can you read some of the answers from the survey?
Yes, so most people said either 0.15% or 0.4%. We had a few who said 3.1% and one who said 9.3%. And I think everyone may be able to see that on their screens. And I'm going to stop sharing so
Thank
we can see
you.
the real answers.
That's helpful. So in 2006, the share of large foundation giving that went to Native organizations and causes was 0.6% of total giving. And this proportion declined to 0.4% by 2012. So that's less than half a percentage of large foundation giving is going to Native communities. From 2012 to 2014, a study of community foundations in 10 states found that 0.15% of community foundations funding goes to Native organizations and causes annually. So we think that this proportion may actually be lower. And we'll talk more about the data issues later, but that's something that we definitely want to continue having conversations with MCF and with you all, because it's equity is a hot topic today, and it's an important topic. And what does equity in giving to Native communities look like if we aren't even experiencing equity in giving? How is this session going to address this inequity? And one of the issues that we do know is that we don't even honestly have the correct data to understand how much money is going to Native organizations. Because right now, a lot of the data we have is that, this is money that's going to serve Native communities. But the money that these percentages that are going to Native-led organizations are actually much, much lower. So as the description for this session stated, decisions that impact or exclude Native people are made across all sectors, including philanthropy, by individuals at organizations and institutions who do not have a basic understanding of Native communities. And this invisibility, this erasure, is one root cause of underfunding of Indian country. And so today we're hoping to build upon your understanding so you can better support Native communities and address the underfunding of Native-led organizations.
So today we're going to be going over quite a few things kind of quickly. First, some terminology. Second, introduction to Native nations, tribal citizenship and enrollment, urban Native communities, data issues, ways of being and protocols when you're going to community, and the importance of language and education. And we will end with time for questions and answers and show you a few more resources that will be included in the slides that we send out after the presentation. So there's so many things that we could talk about, and any of these topics, a presentation could go all day just on one specific topic. So we are keeping it pretty high level. We are moving pretty quickly with the hopes that you will become familiarized with some of the terms that you'll come up with when you're learning more. We hope you'll want to learn more. And hope that we can provide some more resources and connections to further that learning. All right, so starting with some terminology. Today, these are some things you'll hear today and in your work with Native communities. Things you may have already heard, but weren't quite sure exactly what it meant. We're often asked, what's the most appropriate way to refer to our communities? And the short answer is it's preferred that you use the specific name of tribes and tribal communities whenever possible. And if you don't know, ask. We're so eager to share who we are and to get people to know what our tribe is all about. However, depending on the context, it may make more sense to use one of the terms listed on the slide. depending on, if you're talking about Native communities more broadly. And know that across Native communities, there are varying individual preferences about using or not using some of these terms. So the first is American Indian and Alaska Native. It's the US Census category, and it's often used in legal documents and laws. American Indian refers to people connected to the tribal nations of the continental US, and Alaska Native refers to the people connected to tribal nations and villages of Alaska. Native American generally refers to all Native people of the United States and its territories, including American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and American Samoans. It can cover people from Canadian First Nations and Indigenous communities in Mexico, South and Central America who are living in the United States. Many people, including myself, will use the term Native interchangeably with a lot of these terms. And you may hear some folks say Indian. A lot of organizations use Indian or American Indian. My tribe even uses Seneca Nation of Indians. It's very commonly used within our communities, and but we also suggest that you not use it unless there's some sort of familiar relationship that you have with someone. It's typically not something that is preferred that you use. Advise really against using it. Our next term, Indigenous. It's often used as part of the acronym BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. However, Indigenous is very broad, as it can refer to the native or original inhabitants of any place across the world, depending on the context. So the Indigenous people of New Zealand or the Sami people are Indigenous in Europe. So it's really a really broad term. So try to keep it narrow whenever possible. So when you're referring generally to the Indigenous people of the United States, American Indian or Native American are broadly understood and usually acceptable. Native and Indigenous are also acceptable as terms on their own, but they're not as commonly understood depending on the audience. So context is really important when you're using those terms. And again, be really specific if you can use the name of the tribal communities whenever possible. Finally, a few more terms. Reservation and trust lands are very, very simply, we'll get a little bit more into this later. They are lands governed by tribal communities. Reservations and lands beyond reservation borders can be held in trust by the federal government on behalf of Native communities and individuals. Indian country. Despite the complicated history of the term Indian country is generally accepted as a way to describe Native spaces and places within the United States. And it's inclusive of the hundreds of tribal nations that occupy these spaces. It's not exclusive to reservations and trust land. The term is generally used positively within Native communities and publications. So our Indian Country Today is one of our news publications, right there in the name. And in law, the term Indian country with a lowercase c is found in several areas of the US Code, and it's an official term, legal term used in Supreme Court opinions in reference to land associated with Native nations and peoples. Again, use the specific community names or reservation names whenever possible. And then finally, we're going to use the terms United States and federal or federal government interchangeably. They all mean the same thing today.
Thank you, Stephanie. So let's look at Indian country. At one time, there were, excuse me. At one time, there were tens of millions of Indigenous people inhabiting North America. We had a multitude of diverse, thriving communities with unique, complex governance systems, laws, cultural practices, and languages. And all of this existed long before European contact. this map represents kind of, what's happened between 1776 and 1887. The US seized over 1.5 billion acres from America's indigenous people by treaty and executive order. And this map is a depiction of that transfer, that loss of native land during that time. As the blue indigenous homeland sections disappear, small red areas appear, indicating the establishment of reservations. And as European settlers moved westward, Native nations signed treaties ceding vast territories to the United States governments in exchange for guarantees of much smaller but secure reservations and other forms of support. Unfortunately, as we know, the federal government very quickly reneged on their treaty obligations. They didn't hold up their end of the deal, which were already, not equal deals. And beginning in the 1880s, the US enacted legislation that resulted in Native Americans losing ownership and control of 2/3 of the reservation lands that were left. So according to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, that loss totaled 90 million acres, about the size of Montana. Little bit of information about trust land, as we mentioned before, reservation and tribal lands can be held in trust by the US government. This means that the tribes or individual tribal members do not hold title to these lands. The federal government holds the title for the benefit, if you will, of the tribal community. So tribes may hold fee simple land out of trust, but this land is taxable. The total land mass under American Indian or Alaska Native control is about 100 million acres. And that would make Indian country the 4th largest state in the United States. Although, important to remember that this is all native land. We just don't hold that title any longer. There are about 326 federal Indian reservations lands that were reserved by tribes and treaties and agreements with the United States or with tribal land areas, including pueblos and rancherias, which are more in the southwest part of the country. Some tribes have non-reservation or non-trust land. To convert these to trust land, they need to be approved transfer. They need to get that transfer approved through a trust to fee land process, which includes engaging neighboring communities who might be hostile to Native people, who do not want to lose their tax base or think that they will be, putting up a casino, or there's often issues there. A few tribes have reservations established under state law, and a few tribes do not have any territory or land base recognized under either federal or state law. So in Minnesota, we don't have any state recognized tribes. We do have just federally recognized tribes. But that's something to be aware of, is in other parts of the country, there are state recognized tribes as well. Tribes and their members do retain many use rights for activities such as fishing, gathering on traditional lands outside of their reservation, trust lands, and fee simple lands as well. Pop quiz time. Curious if folks have an understanding, and please utilize the chat or access the Zoom survey. There's no prizes here, but we hope you play anyways. How many federally recognized tribes in the US do you think there are today? Stephanie, can you read some of the responses?
Unmuting. Okay, so the options were 168. We have about 15% of people thought 168. About 38% said 392. 43% said 574, and 2% said 887.
Thank you. So there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the US. And approximately 229 are in Alaska. The rest are located across 35 states. How about in Minnesota? How many do you think there are? Stephanie, can you share some of the responses?
Yes, they are coming in very quickly. All right, about 14% said 4, about 60% said 11, 16% said 19, and 10% said 32.
All right. So there are 11 tribes, 11 federally recognized tribes anyway, in Minnesota, 7 Ojibwe, and 4 Dakota nations. So important for folks to understand that. But we want to talk a little bit about what does that even mean? What does federal recognition mean? And to understand this, we first need to understand the concept of tribal sovereignty. And so we want to share a short video from the Native Governance Center, which is a organization that's based here in Minnesota, and to give us a better understanding of what tribal sovereignty means.
Just make sure you can hear the audio too.
Tribal sovereignty. It's a phrase you've likely heard before, but what does it really mean? Sovereignty is the natural right of a people to govern themselves. Sovereignty means that tribes operate as independent nations within a nation. And did you know that there are 574 federally recognized Native nations in the United States? All of these tribes have their own constitutions, laws, elections, and infrastructure designed to meet their people's needs. Their rights, lands, assets, and resources are their own. This is similar to how the United States government exercises sovereignty on behalf of its citizens. Tribal nations have been sovereign since time immemorial. Sovereignty is not granted, but rather it is recognized. The federal government recognizes tribe sovereignty through treaties. In order to make a treaty, 2 sovereign nations must come together, recognize each other's right to govern their own people, and create an agreement. With or without the United States, tribal nations are sovereign. But if you need more proof, the United States Constitution, in addition to hundreds of treaties and Supreme Court cases, has repeatedly affirmed tribes' right to govern themselves. Remember, tribal nations have always been and will always be sovereign. Treaties are the supreme law of the land. The United States government's frequent violations of its treaty obligations do not change that. Now that we understand what sovereignty is, why is sovereignty important? Sovereignty matters because sovereign nations know best what their people need. Tribal governments make vital decisions for their people related to healthcare, education, and economic development, among others. When Native nations make their own decisions, they are more likely to thrive. Strong, sovereign tribal governments foster strong tribal economies and nations. We honor and affirm tribal sovereignty. To learn more about why sovereignty matters, visit nativegov.org or treatiesmatter.org.
So federal recognition means that the U.S. acknowledges a tribe's political status as a government with the right to self-govern as a sovereign. So this is an inherent right. This is not something that we were granted. We have had our own governments, since before the United States was a thing. So these tribes are recognized as having a government to government relationship with the United States through treaties. And tribal governments maintain the power to determine their own governance structures and enforce laws through police departments and tribal courts. The government exercise these inherent rights through the development of their distinct forms of government structures by determining citizenship, establishing civil and criminal laws for their nations. In addition, tribal governments are responsible for a broad range of governmental activities on tribal lands, including education, healthcare, environmental protection, natural resource management, and the development and maintenance of basic infrastructure such as housing, roads, sewers, and broadband connections. The federal government is incredibly complex. It can take decades to complete. The federal recognition process is incredibly complex, and it can take decades to complete this application process with no guarantees. And so non-recognized tribes often have difficulty collecting the proper documentation required by the US government. Acknowledgement can also be sought through legislation. But again, this also is not an easy process to navigate. Tribes who are unable to receive federal recognition may be recognized by the state, again, which we mentioned earlier, under an assortment of state laws, and state recognition results in limited acknowledgement and benefits for tribes not federally recognized and their members, and these vary by state. And again, in Minnesota, we don't have any state recognized tribes, but they do exist in other parts of the country. So what is a treaty, and do they still exist? Yes, short answer. Treaties are agreements between two sovereigns. And so to reiterate, tribal sovereignty existed long before Europeans came to the United States. It was not something that was given to us by the US. We already had it. And this is really important because a lot of people really don't understand this. In fact, the US demonstrated their sovereignty to Europe by holding up the fact that they had made treaties with our communities. Treaties are a recognition of our sovereign rights, not a granting of rights. Treaties did not give tribes land. It was already ours. And we, in a way, agreed to share it in exchange for something. Although, as we know, the US did not hold up their end of the deal and many of the treaty relationships. And so it's a very complicated conversation in history. Since colonization, approximately 368 treaties were negotiated and signed by US commissioners and tribal leaders and approved by the US Senate between 1777 and 1868. Supreme Court decisions and presidential and congressional action have affirmed their status as the supreme law of the land. And that's a quote from Supreme Court decisions. So these treaties, they take precedence over state laws. Treaties often include guarantees of peace, provision on land boundaries, hunting and fishing rights, often including land outside reservation boundaries, federal recognition of US powers, and promises of US protection. They also included many specific promises that the US would provide for healthcare, education, housing, economic development, and agricultural assistance. So this is the basis of federal funding and programs for Native people and communities today, also known as principles of the federal trust responsibility. So it was in exchange for land, we were promised these things. But unfortunately, we've been incredibly under-resourced when it comes to these promises. So the federal government has a responsibility to provide tribal lands, tribal government and tribal citizens and to provide for federal assistance to ensure the continuation of tribal communities under treaty law. So do they still exist? Absolutely. So while the practice of treaty making between our governments no longer exists, the existing treaties are as valid today as on the day they were signed and ratified. The relationship has been defined in case law and statute as a political relationship that further distinguishes American Indians from racial classification for purposes of affirmative action laws and in other federal statutes that establish federally funded programs for the general public. However, our communities have continuously fought challenges to our sovereignty and the agreements the federal government made through these treaties. Cases have been brought forth to U.S. courts at all levels to force the government to uphold their promises, which have overwhelmingly been broken. And while there's a lot to unpack about the treaty making process because of cultural differences related to land ownership concepts, deception and unjust practices around their creation, they are in the eyes of this the law of this country as binding legal documents. And so this is incredibly important as tribal sovereignty is critical to most, if not it, all issues facing our communities. Self-government is essential if tribal communities are to continue to protect their unique cultures and identities. All right. So I know we're moving a little bit behind. So I'm not going to share too much about this photograph, but I do want you to know that this is a painting that hung in the Minnesota State Capitol for many years. Many saw it as a sign of a peaceful negotiation, and it was not. This sign depicts a treaty between the United States government and our Dakota people, where we were relegated to a 20-acre strip of land along the river, while the rest of the land was opened up for European settlement here in Minnesota. And so this picture has a very complicated history for a number of reasons, but just wanted to encourage folks to get a better understanding of the backstory here, and know that this is a picture that was hung in the Capitol for many years.
Thank you, Carly. The 574 federally recognized Native nations and additional state recognized tribes might be named using any of the terms listed on this slide. Throughout colonization and the recognition process, some communities were split apart within a tribe and some of our communities joined across tribes. This may cause a little bit of confusion. And on top of that, many tribes have a legal formal name that they did not originally use for themselves. And some tribes may use a name in their language that is not widely known or that related tribes don't use. Our names often translate in our language to the people of a particular place. So looking at some tribes that use different names, the Flandreau Santee Sioux tribe, the Santee Sioux Nation, and the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate meaning the people, are three federally recognized tribes. All are part of the greater Dakota people, but have different terms used in their formal names. Present day nations may be legally recognized along with other tribes. For example, one federally recognized tribe in North Dakota on the Fort Berthold Reservation is the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, also known as the MHA Nation or the Three Affiliated Tribes. This single federally recognized tribe is made up of three nations, each with their own distinct language, separate bands, clans, and ceremonial practices. Part of their story is that they came together after the smallpox epidemic in the 17 and 1800s for economic and social survival. However, it's clear in seeing them that they have maintained their distinct identities through to today. It's important that you do your research and get to know the communities where you live, where you visit, and where you work.
Thank you, Stephanie. So in Minnesota, again, we have 11 federally recognized tribes, including Ojibwe and Dakota communities. And often the present day names and structures of our modern governance models were not necessarily determined by us. And that has led to some challenges. For example, I'm a citizen of the Flinders Santee Sioux tribe. That's our legal name, but I come from Bade-Wakantawa band, which resided here in the Twin Cities. I'm also Sisitawa, Wahpetuwa, Yanktane. These are all parts of my identities. I'm also Muskogee Creek on my mom's side. But on the Dakota side, these groups are all part of a larger group of people called the Oceti Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires, more commonly known as the Sioux Nation. And you may have heard that name before. Oceti Sakowin Camp in Standing Rock during No DAPL became, I think, gained some recognition from folks. But there were historically 7 kind of major divisions or council fires. Again, the 7 council fires, each with a distinct but also very similar culture. We were and are divided up even further by dialects and geographic differences, known as Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. And so to the east, Dakota, Bade-Wakantawa, the Spirit Lake people, also known as Midawakaton, Wahpekute, the shooters among the leaves, Wahpetawa, the people dwelling amongst the leaves, and Sisitawa, people of the fish villages, are referred to as the Santee or Eastern Dakota. And then in the middle are the Yankton, Ihanktawana folks, and then Titawa, or the dwellers of the plains, are called Lakota. And that's where my husband and my son are from that community. And so today, we have multiple tribal governments, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and communities are located in Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, in the US, and in Canada. And a lot of folks don't know that a lot of our Dakota people, when we were exiled from Minnesota, many of our people fled up to Canada. And so there are a lot of Dakota communities, a lot of relatives up there. All right. Next slide. Oh, here we go. Thank you, Stephanie. So the ancestors of our Ojibwe relatives lived throughout northeastern part of North America and along the Atlantic coast. And due to a combination of prophecies and tribal warfare, around 1,500 years ago, the Ojibwe people left their homes along the ocean and began this slow migration westward that lasted for many centuries. And I do not pretend to be an expert on Ojibwe history, and so I apologize if for any of my Ojibwe relatives if I don't get this completely right, and welcome folks helping me understand. But my understanding is that Ojibwe oral history and archaeological records provide evidence that those ancestors moved in small groups following the Great Lakes westward. And an Ojibwe prophecy urged them to move west to the land where food grows on water. And that was a clear reference to wild rice and served as a major incentive to migrate westward into Minnesota. And eventually some bands made their homes in the northern area of present day Minnesota. The most populous tribe in North America, the Ojibwe, live in both the United States and Canada, and occupy land around the entire Great Lakes, including Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario. So the name Ojibwe might be drawn from either the puckered seam of the Ojibwe moccasin or the Ojibwe custom of writing on birch bark. Ojibwe people are traditionally divided up by a number of clans named for animals, and this served as a government as well as a means of dividing labor. There are 7 distinct Ojibwe nations in Minnesota, and one in North Dakota, Turtle Mountain, Bois Fort or Nett Lake, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, White Earth, and Red Lake. Six tribes or bands are members of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is an umbrella kind of centralized governance structure. But they each have their own reservation. They do share language, culture, treaties, but they do have an interesting structure here in Minnesota under the Minnesota Chippewa tribe that a lot of folks don't know about, and it is something that more folks should know about. Red Lake Nation is not a member of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, and they declined to participate. My understanding was it was because they wanted to keep their hereditary chiefs, or eventually they moved toward elected leadership, but they still maintain this individual status. And so, that's something that I think is interesting for folks to understand, is that these other Ojibwe nations did join together under this structure. And while Red Lake chose not to, and therefore they do have a unique difference, they are, it's just a unique designation. So they didn't sign on to some of the treaty agreements with the state of Minnesota that others did, which makes them unique. Next slide, please, Stephanie. So while many of you are working within the Minnesota state boundaries as your service area, we want to take a step back and recognize that state boundaries are not our borders. And so, this particular map, I used to work for the Bush Foundation, and I was always very proud of the fact that, our region was Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 Native nations. And when we shared this map, you'll notice that at least the internal state boundaries aren't there. And that's out of respect for tribal sovereignty and honoring that those are not our boundaries. And so something to think about is, as foundations, as you think about your service areas, how do you recognize the fact that our these indigenous or the colonial boundaries are not the same as our indigenous boundaries, and something that's really important, especially for, as I think about being a Dakota person in Minnesota, the majority of our people were exiled. And so a lot of things that I see show up and benefit to Native communities in Minnesota, I'm very proud, and I work hard for all of those things. And as a tribal member from South Dakota, sometimes I'm not eligible for some of those benefits. And so something to just think about when you think about your service areas.
So we've talked a lot about tribes, and tribes are made up of people. As we discussed earlier, the US Census found 9.7 million people identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, alone or in combination with another race. This is an increase of 86% since the last census in 2010. Now, the census allows people to self-identify their race, not their political status. And that's really important because being Native is more than a racial or ethnic designation. Tribal members are citizens of 3 sovereigns: the tribe that they are enrolled in, the United States, and the state in which they reside. We're going to use citizenship, membership, and enrollment interchangeably, so you'll hear me switch between them. Again, as sovereigns, tribes can determine their own citizenship requirements. Indigenous communities throughout the world originally determined membership based on kinship, lineage, family ties, and even adoption. For example, my tribe is matrilineal, which means if your mother was Seneca, you are also Seneca. If your wife is Seneca, you become Seneca. Or for my distant great-grandmother, an Irish immigrant captured and traded to the Seneca who adopted her. She became Seneca, and all of her 11 plus children were born Seneca. Today, tribal citizenship criteria are established by tribal constitutions or policy, and each tribe maintains their own enrollment records. Because criteria varies from tribe to tribe, there isn't a uniform membership requirement. The only uniform requirement is that you may not be enrolled in more than one tribe. And you're not just born a member and given a tribal number. In most cases, your parent applies to the tribal council, our legislative body. They review and approve the applications to enroll you as a tribal member. This is a photo of me and my family with a group of other families during my nephew's enrollment a few years ago. They're so cute. Without getting too specific, the main way tribes determine eligibility for enrollment is through ancestry. Is their parent enrolled? Can they prove they're directly descended from someone on an original list of members at the time their constitution was established? A list called the rolls, or known as the rolls. And the proof piece is highly challenging as we're reliant on colonial forms of documentation that may not be valid or available for multiple reasons. The rolls, for example, may have been created by a federal agent who likely wasn't a trusted figure in the community. Other conditions such as tribal residency and continued contact with the tribe are also common. And the most controversial information used is blood quantum. Blood quantum is a concept created by the federal government to establish legally defined racial groups. It is the documented degree of Indian blood, and you can see on these tribal ID cards, we have the DIB. Later, many tribes began using and were encouraged to use them by the federal government to put minimum blood quantum requirements in their constitutions. The federal government also uses them to determine eligibility for benefits. Even if someone's enrolled in a tribe, they will ask for, what is your degree of Indian blood? Let's see. Also about these cards, these are official ID cards. We're supposed to be able to use them as you would a state ID. Valid ID for voting, banking, job orientations, even traveling to Canada. But due to lack of knowledge or racism, we're often denied our right to use these documents. And some tribes don't have or haven't had the resources to make them legit, that like state requirements with a picture, for example. Carly, would you share a little bit more about blood quantum?
Yeah, so blood quantum and enrollment is a super complicated and controversial topic within our communities. It's something that, again, our governments have the ability to define for themselves what tribal citizenship looks like, and that's important for recognizing and upholding tribal sovereignty. And at the same time, this colonial structure of blood quantum is a very hard topic of conversation. I can share for, my own story. My grandfather was an orphan and he grew up in boarding schools. And so because of that, he didn't have a birth certificate. So while I am enrolled in my tribe, and I'm I have my blood quantum on my tribal enrollment card. It tells me I can prove 7/16, but I know that that's not a legit number. And what does that even mean? In large part because my grandfather didn't have a birth certificate, and so we can't prove, even though he was a fluent speaker, and that is a hard part of my family's history. And that those are the stories that, when, just so you know, like I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, and I know Stephanie and I have both talked about this, as Native people, especially as mixed Native folks, being asked like, oh, you're Native? I had no idea. I had a not my current organization, but a former organization, a board member, said that to me and said, I would have never guessed you're Native. How much Native are you? And I said, all of me. Like, how am I supposed to respond to that? But these are the kinds of questions that we get asked. And so just want you to know that they're not appropriate, and that it's a complicated topic, that our communities are navigating. All right.
We wanted to talk about gaming, but we're not going to have time. So maybe if we have some questions about it, because it's also a pretty controversial topic or misunderstood topic, but we're going to move ahead and talk about our urban Native relatives. While Carly and I both have one parent who grew up on our reservations, we, like many Native people, grew up off reservation. In fact, 78% of American Indian and Alaska Natives live off reservation, and over 70% live in urban areas. The number of Native people living in urban settings accelerated in the 50s and 60s because of the Indian termination era of federal Indian policy. It encouraged Native people to leave their reservations for greater opportunities in the cities. During that period, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, also developed a relocation program that encouraged Natives to move to urban areas. While they were not necessarily forced to move, the BIA promoted unduly optimistic portrayals of life in urban areas and made promises of support as they were getting settled into their new communities, including housing and job programs. But many Native people were unprepared for the challenges of city life, and they often encountered discrimination and had difficulty getting jobs and housing, because those programs that they were promised did not exist. Many returned to reservations, but some couldn't afford to. The program the BIA ran was abolished in the 70s, but a lot of people still remain in urban areas. And without that assistance that was promised by the BIA. Employment, education, and housing in tribal communities are huge reasons for this movement. Many reservations have unemployment rates over 50%. And now, as Native people moved to urban areas, the Native nonprofit sector grew to fill the gaps where the needs of the people were not being met and where promises had been broken. Many of these nonprofits exist today. There's a ton in Minneapolis. You may be aware of the Minneapolis American Indian Center, which started during that time. It's the first urban Indian center in the country. And Little Earth of United Tribes. It's the first Indian preference housing development in the country. And they fought for special designation from HUD to be able to prioritize Native people. It's kind of a fluke. There's a letter from HUD that made this designation. And much of this work in Minneapolis, early work in Minneapolis, can be connected to the efforts of the American Indian Movement, which was a Red Power civil rights movement founded in Minneapolis on Franklin Avenue, where many of our Native people and nonprofits continue to reside. And here's a little bit of that data. But in Minnesota, you'll also find people from tribes across the country, in addition to Ojibwe and Dakota people. I have 16 of those specific people or specific tribes listed on this slide for you to review later.
Thank you, Stephanie. So we've used data throughout this presentation, but haven't really mentioned that the data, well, we did bring it up. It's likely wrong, and we know that, and that's an issue that needs to be addressed. So correct data is a necessity in regards to federal treaty obligations, and for your foundations to understand our communities, and how we're impacted, and what the numbers really look like as far as service to our communities. So we have a few resources linked, talking about issues with specific types of data. If you're using COVID-19 census or broadband data to inform your foundation strategy, programs, and funding decisions, that data is likely incorrect, related to Native communities, or lumps Native people into an other category. And so that's something that's really important to know, and why it's really important to engage with us, so that we can give you a better understanding of the reality. We've used the census data a few times today, and it's likely flawed as well. In the 2010 census, American Indian, Alaska Natives living on reservations were undercounted by 4.9%, more than twice the next undercounted group, which were African Americans, who were undercounted at 2.1%. And in 1990, American Indian, Alaska Natives on reservations were undercounted by 12%. One way researchers and foundations collecting data can ensure data is more accurate is by, again, engaging with us from the very beginning of the process as research strategy is being developed, figuring out the language to use, how to connect with people. And we have one article from a Hawaiian nonprofit on community-based participatory research protocols that we think could be helpful for folks. Now, specific to foundations, we talked at the very beginning about how 0.4% of large foundation dollars go to Native organizations and causes. And we, again, believe that number, again, data issue, we think it's actually lower. First, how do foundations define what it means for a grant to be Native serving? Do organizations who check this box serving serve a geography with a large or small Native population? Do they have 1 or 20 Native participants? Do they donate decades old school books to reservations? Like, what is, what is it that makes their grants Native serving? And secondly, foundations and philanthropy serving foundations do not know what it means to be a Native-led nonprofit in many situations, or the importance of Native-led, and are not keeping track of this data as well. And we think that's something that needs to change and that we're hoping to work on. And so even if foundations do think about these things as a sector, philanthropy has inconsistent systems, trainings, procedures to record, analyze, and report data to ensure this information is accurate. Current nonprofit accountability and charitable giving platforms don't have a consistent or reliable way to research Native-led or Native serving organizations. So what can be done to address these issues? First, again, connecting with existing coalitions that are working on addressing and conversing around this issue. Native Ways Federation, Native Americans in Philanthropy, which I also serve on the board of. There's conversations that are happening to try to make these systems better, but we could use more support for sure. And having those conversations with foundations is really important. And so our vision is to create at Native Ways, is to eventually create our own giving and information platform. And we, our members and the Native nonprofit sector, know ourselves best how we can help support, how we can find support for this work and connect with existing platforms to improve the information available to foundations and individual donors and all across the philanthropy sector. So finally, learn more, review links on these slides. We're going to send you even more information. We want to stay connected. Again, we want this to be the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And we want to help connect you all with information so that you can be better allies and better support systems for Native communities.
All right, we are nearing our finish here. We're just going to do a brief introduction of these links. I want you to do a little homework, watch the video, take a look at the article. But the first link is for a video about Waduka Dading, an Ojibwe language immersion school in Wisconsin, where children are learning language, music, sciences, math, health, art, dance, food, gathering and preparation, teamwork, and other essential life skills. So while we don't have time to really delve into why language is so important to Native people, it is a good opportunity for us to share that you don't need a Native specific funding program to support Native communities. Whatever funding program you have, there's highly likely a Native organization whose work aligns with that program. You'll need to be intentional about reaching out to us and Native communities to find these organizations. We're doing great work. Now for the second link, we're thinking way back to our introductory question about the lack of Indigenous representation in social studies standards. There's major developments underway to counteract this in Minnesota. And this article is a conversation with Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan about a $1.3 million investment Minnesota is making through their Department of Education to develop curricular resources for all Minnesota students on Indigenous history and contemporary knowledge, and to invest in expert staff and consultation. So if you've got an education program or whatever program you have, is there a way that you can help build the education of Minnesota students? So if you're interested in learning about education and language, I'll let you know that Carly would love to hear from anyone interested. Talk to you about the federal government's history of stripping us of our language and culture through educational policy, and how critical language and Indigenous education pedagogy is to our survival as Native people and communities.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. I know we've only got 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I'm going to move through this part pretty quickly, but please know that we can always come back to it at a later time if folks want to reach out. The protocol stuff is important. It's key, especially at non-Native organizations. I'm going to be honest with you, when you're reaching out to Native people, whether for information, support, guidance, whatever it may be, you're building relationship, and it's important that it's a reciprocal process. And so they're learning from you, but you are also learning from them. And so this is just being a good colleague, being a good human, and not necessarily specific to Native folks, but still. Native people are used to being mined for information. We're some of the most studied research people out there, even though the data is so inconsistent and incorrect. It's ironic, but often from an outsider looking in perspective. And so often that information collected has been used against us. And there are trust issues with outsiders, including with foundations. And so relationship is key. If you tell, somebody, Carly sent me, or, that you have a relationship with us, they're going to likely pick up the phone because they know that I have a relationship with my community. And so while it's important to have people like that in your networks, you also need to cultivate that within your organization. You need to build those relationships for yourself and build trust with community. While a trusted person like us, we can help make those introductions and provide some support. It's up to you to follow through with that and to show up and be in community with folks. And so if you reach out to folks and they don't respond to you, ask yourself why that is. What are they getting in return? It may be compensation, it may be a grant, but that's not what I'm talking about. Our folks are really, really busy. We're working on, I mean, we just touched the surface on the things today that our communities are dealing with. And so you need to know that we're very busy folks. And so if we're not responsive, or, you know, if you're struggling with finding some connections, reach out to Native Ways. We're happy to help make those connections, but also just remember the importance of being in relationship and showing up. Also, just want to throw this out there. We need more Native people in philanthropy. So hiring staff from the Native communities, building relationships with the staff that you have, helping to get that representation out there is a huge thing. And Native Americans in Philanthropy has a program officer working group that has been coming together over the last couple years, and I think they're expanding it to include other staff members at foundations. But please reach out to them if when you're looking to recruit staff as well. So really quick, also with the protocol piece, know who you're talking to. Advice we shared with engaging with tribes. Do some homework before you engage with a person or community to both benefit the work, but also just because it's a good thing to do. This is our history, but it's our collective history. And so if you're engaging with a tribe, know how to pronounce their tribal name. If you don't know, ask, and look up their tribal website before you go out there, or even before you get on the phone. There's amazing information that's out there. And doing that little bit of research will be hugely beneficial to building those relationships. Finally, I just want to share that visiting is Native talk for getting to know each other. So Native people love to visit. So yeah, I'm speaking generally. This won't apply to everyone. But building relationship and trust, is huge. And sitting down, and I know it's hard with the pandemic, but even with Zoom or a phone call, if we can just, take the time to get to know each other. Again, this doesn't have to be Native specific. I think we could all use this. In across cultures and communities, but it's something that we do lift up, is the importance of visiting, and then listening and asking for input. Making sure to don't just listen, but hear us. And so when you ask for our input about your programs, about other things, show us where how that shows up. Because we notice when we're being asked for information and then it doesn't kind of show up in the final product, I guess. And then the last thing I'll just share is be open as you go out into Indian country. For those of you who have experience with this, you understand you're going to get teased. And if Native humor is it's something that I'm really proud of. And if you're getting teased, it actually means you're doing something right. It means that you're being welcomed in. And so be okay with that. And kind of, you have to kind of leave your humility. Humility is a big thing. And leave your ego at the door, because it's gonna show up. And you'll grow from this. And so just want to put that out there. All right. We are over time here. So I want to be able to answer some questions. So would love if anybody has any questions, to please feel free to put them in the chat, or send them to us either today or another day is fine too. And we're happy to continue to make these connections and build these relationships with you all.
There were a couple questions from earlier that I was responding to, but someone had asked, what are our thoughts on non-native people learning native languages? And I encourage you to learn native languages. It's going to help you understand our communities and our ways of being and the places where you live. Native languages are descriptive, and so you can really understand the history of a certain place through the names. Yeah, that's what I think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, I feel like part of it is we need more people speaking the language, and it's one thing to learn the language and to honor it and respect it. It's another thing to try to become native. And I think that's one of the things that some people in our community have struggled with is you know, having non-native folks decide that they're kind of experts in our language or our culture. And so that's a whole different thing. But we need my opinion is we need as many speakers as we can get. And so as long as you know, are willing to come in and learn and follow the lead of Native people is the biggest thing, is you know, follow the lead of Native people and use it, share it, and promote Native folks who are teaching and learning as well.
We have another question. Has genetic testing changed tribal membership policies? I would say no, because those genetic tests, they tell you if you're Native American, and they give you a whole continent. They can't really tell you what tribe.
Yeah, I would recommend, what is her name? Kim Tallbear. She's done a ton of research on this. And so I would recommend, and we can share a link on that, about some of the issues with that genetic testing in Indian country.
Another question. Are reservation populations growing, or are more people still moving off the reservation?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would love to know if anybody else does, honestly. Because I do think there are, the trend has been continuously, I think, for folks moving to urban areas, but at the same time, I kind of wonder how that's going to change now, especially as we're living in this kind of, we're not post-COVID, we're still in COVID, but there are more like remote working opportunities, and you know, part of me wonders if we won't see more folks moving back to our tribal communities, which I think would be a good thing. Honestly, you know, if we want representation across sectors, in our recruitment and, you know, staffing, we need to be hiring folks from the communities that we're trying to serve. So if we can meet them there and let them actually live in the communities, in those tribal communities, I think our foundation programs would benefit from that.
We have some more questions. We would like to be more accountable regarding giving to Native-led and Native serving organizations. Do you have any suggestions on best practice or a foundation who has set up data and systems in a way to do this well? How have they operationalized this in their grant systems? How have they defined terms in a way that leads to more authentic accountability?
We did a lot of work at the Bush Foundation when I was there on this. And I'm not sure exactly where things are at now, but I would recommend reaching out to them, reach out to me. We actually, Native Ways would love to host, and hoping to be in conversation with MCF about this. but to host some foundation conversations about this data issue specifically, and bring, make sure that folks like Bush and others are at the table. Northwest Area Foundation, they have a commitment that, a certain percentage of their funds go to Native-led organizations, so they have their own systems. But we're not really talking about those systems. We haven't had those conversations. So if folks are interested in being a part of that conversation and want to reach out, please do, because we would love to help host that.
So I'd like to use this then as an opportunity to encourage members to look at registering for our next session that is going to take place next Tuesday on May 3rd. And we are going to be reaching three individuals that are very familiar about grant making through their foundations or through their associations, and working with foundations that have made kind of this commitment and probably do have those best practices that they can share. So next week, we're going to have Eileen Briggs, who is with the Bush Foundation, Andreas Hippel, who is an independent consultant, but was with the Better Way Foundation, and Eric Tork, who's the director of grant making for the Northland Foundation. So there will be that opportunity right around the corner, as well as other opportunities as being offered by Carly to be available to think about this much deeper. So with that, I would like to say again, thank you so much, Carly and Stephanie, for this excellent presentation. This is, I know people are going to grab this when they get this in their hands, and hopefully we'll be able to distribute that. And if everyone can just maybe kind of give their appreciation and kind of a round of applause for our presenters, since we can't go around the room. And I know there's some hearts that are going up. I love that. So on behalf of We Are Still Here and the Minnesota Council on Foundations, Gitchi Miigwech, big thank you to both of you. And we'll see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.